Welcome to today's webinar on methane mitigation and nutrition security. As we gather here today on Earth Day, we confront a dual challenge that demands our immediate attention and collective action. Reducing methane emissions in our food system while safeguarding and indeed increasing access to nutritious food for all. With 3.1 billion people unable to afford a nutritious diet, we don't have the luxury of focusing on mitigation without also considering how these actions affect people's health and nutrition. Recent momentum, particularly evident during COP28, has underscored the imperative to address methane emissions in the food system. Methane, despite representing a smaller share of total greenhouse gas emissions, poses a higher warming potential than carbon dioxide. Annually, our food systems contribute approximately 60% of total global methane emissions, primarily from three sources: livestock, food loss and waste, and rice cultivation. Yet, as we embark on this journey towards methane mitigation, we must remain steadfast in our commitment to nutrition security. Our efforts should not inadvertently exacerbate existing inequalities or compromise individuals' access to nutritious foods. In fact, some national leaders in the global South consider methane emissions as the price they pay for food and nutrition security. Change necessitates a nuanced approach that considers affordability, availability, awareness, and nutritional value, a delicate balance we must strive to maintain alongside the urgency of climate mitigation efforts. The complex realities around the world warrant differential solutions to best meet these needs in diverse country contexts. What may work best for ranchers and consumers in rural Iowa will likely vary from smallholder farmer communities in Bihar, India. We will need all hands on deck with creative and tailored solutions to reduce methane emissions without compromising on access to nutrition. While governmental commitments are crucial, the private sector also plays a pivotal role in driving meaningful change. Through collective action and collaboration across industries, we can harness the power of innovation and technology to implement sustainable solutions at scale. Today, we extend an invitation to all stakeholders to join us in this endeavor, emphasizing the importance of inclusive participation. With this overview, FSF, EDF, and 4SD are excited to announce a co-creation process we are embarking on with industry to pave realistic pathways forward. As Earthren Cousin, as the executive director of FSF, we are excited about this first phase of this process, which is our listening phase, a listening program, a platform for dialogue and engagement with diverse stakeholders across the food system. Through this program, we aim to gather insights, address barriers, and co-create solutions that resonate with the needs of diverse global food systems communities. We encourage all interested parties to reach out and participate in our co-design process, as together we chart course pathways towards a more sustainable and equitable future for all. Now, over to our moderator, Danny Nierenberg, president of Food Tank, to introduce our distinguished panelists and guide the conversation moving forward. Danny, happy Earth Day, and over to you.
Happy Earth Day, everyone. Thank you so much, Earthren. Always wonderful to be involved in anything that you do. Earthren mentioned that I am the moderator today. I'm also the president and co-founder of Food Tank, which is a research and advocacy organization really devoted to highlighting stories of hope and success in our food and agriculture systems. And we do this with the aim to inspire, motivate, and ultimately activate positive transformation in how we produce and consume food. I'm really honored to be here this morning, and I want to thank Food Systems for the Future for organizing the event. As Earthrin said, we have a really wonderful discussion plan. We're going to look at the link between food systems and the climate crisis, methane mitigation strategies, and nutrition security. We know that climate action is urgently needed, but as we take steps to protect the environment, we cannot sacrifice eaters' access to safe, nutrient-dense food. So let me go ahead and introduce everyone. We have Catherine Pickus, who is the Vice President of Sustainability and Global Impact at Tyson Foods. We have Bruce Friedrich, the founder and president of the Good Food Institute. We also have Matthias Berninger, who is the Executive Vice President of Public Affairs, Science, Sustainability, and HSE for Bayer AG. And Matthias, I've probably butchered your name, so you can correct me later. And we're joined by Lisa Moon, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Global Food Banking Network. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to the online audience for watching. I'm hoping that we can start by providing what I think is some sort of much needed context for the audience. As Earthrin mentioned, rice cultivation, food loss and waste, and the livestock industry are three of the major contributors to methane emissions in food and agriculture systems. So I'd like to all of the panelists to just take 1 or 2 minutes to explain why each of these topics are so important to address when we're thinking about methane mitigation strategies. And maybe Catherine and Bruce, I can start with you both. Can you talk about how today's livestock industry contributes to methane emissions? What are the impacts of enteric fermentation and waste management? And kind of what is the link with nutrition security? So Bruce, maybe I start with you.
And I've already screwed up the tech, I'm sorry. Sure, thanks, Danny, and delighted to be here. Really grateful for the invitation and excited to be having this conversation. It's so critically important. Livestock is responsible for more methane than any other cause. It's about 50% more than oil and gas put together. It's roughly the same as all fossil fuels put together. And 100% of analyses indicate that livestock numbers are going to continue to rise through 2050. Roughly 60% more ruminants through 2050, according to the World Resources Institute. So we really need an all-of-the-above strategy on livestock interventions. And the one that GFI is focused on is alternative proteins. It's the one food and agriculture responsible to climate response to intervention for climate mitigation that analogizes to renewable energy and electric vehicles. So with renewables, we absolutely need, with energy conservation, everything from more efficient light bulbs to more efficient buildings. But we also need renewables, similar with electric vehicles. The world's going to consume more energy. The world is going to drive more miles, and the world is going to eat more meat. But we can make that meat from plants. We can cultivate that meat from cells. Developed economies are already eating way too much meat. It's driving up the price of food. It's driving up the price of feed crops. It's driving up the price of kind of everything because it's so inefficient. So this is one critical intervention.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Catherine, Bruce mentioned the sort of all of the above strategy, and I'm wondering if you can talk about Tyson's perspective, on the livestock industry and what you're seeing as sort of trends that food businesses are taking on this issue.
Yeah, and thanks. I hope you guys can hear me. I'm dialing in. I just landed in Montreux for the World Business Council for a Sustainable Development meeting, and I didn't want to miss this conversation. So although I'm not on video, I do want to comment on something that we've been partnering with Earthrin on, with EDF, Nature Conservancy, Deloitte, is a mechanism by which we collectively take action to reduce emissions from the value chain. We know that we need access to nutritious food, and there are nutrients inherent in protein, animal protein, that we need to get our arms around. And so for the past 2 years, we've been working diligently in partnership to see what we can do to reduce these emissions. And it's grounded in science. We're making sure that science is leading the discussion, that we are innovating, that we are pulling on the input from a diverse sector of experts to ensure that these reductions are measurable and meaningful. And I'll get to some more points later as it relates to the great work that Lisa Moon and her team is doing and that we're doing in partnership with Bayer and others that really reset this important sector for the livelihood of farmers, but also for the access to nutrition that we all need. We are thinking more and more about how do we invest in the right research around different sources of feed that reduce methane in cattle. How do we think about looking at circular waste strategies that involve, for the first time ever, black soldier fly that take waste, turn it into an alternative feed for poultry. There are solutions, and it's going to take a collective action and a collective effort for us to get there.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I do want to get into that partnership and collaboration aspect as well as the research a little bit later. But now I'd love to turn to Lisa, and I'm wondering if you can talk about the methane emissions that we're seeing from food waste in landfills and why that's such an important issue. When we're talking about nutrition security, I still think that folks aren't kind of making that connection between food waste and nutrition.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. And I just want to echo again everyone's thanks just for being part of this important discussion, especially on Earth Day. So about 18% of all methane emissions are caused by waste, and about half of those waste emissions are coming from organic waste, with the vast majority being food. And so to really put it in a nutshell, we are not able to meet kind of our targets on methane emission reduction without kind of taking a very serious stance on reducing food loss and waste. I think, obviously food loss and waste is a very complicated issue. You see loss happening at nearly every point in the supply chain, starting with on-farm, and then all the way up to retail. And then, of course, at the retail level, at the food service level, in our households, we waste a tremendous amount of food, with about a third of all food being produced going to waste. But Danny, I think the really important point you raised is when we are thinking about the types of food going to waste, a lot of times it is that highly perishable, nutrient-rich food. And so I think, this is not just about throwing calories away. This is about throwing nutrients away in a day and age where food and access is a very real problem for more than 2 billion people. And so I think that with all things, there are opportunities, and there's a lot of really terrific solutions we can consider as we consider the food loss and waste agenda as part of the broader pathways towards methane emission mitigation.
Thank you, Lisa. And I'm glad you focused on nutrients and not just calories. We're seeing that shift as well, that we are throwing away all of this wonderful nutrient-dense food, including not just fruits and vegetables, but also meat products. And that is such a waste in so many ways. Matthias, I'm hoping I can turn to you. Like livestock farmers, rice farmers are often blamed for methane emissions. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how rice cultivation contributes to methane and why it's important that we have strategies that make farmers not the villains here. They never have been, but we need new strategies and new ways of growing rice so that they aren't blamed for these things.
Yeah, thank you so much, Danny. And let me start by stating the size of the price. If you look at all methane emissions related to rice production in the world, they roughly equate the emissions of all coal-fired power plants in the United States of 2018, or the number of all passenger cars on the road in the world. So it's a significant amount of emissions that is related to rice production. Now, rice is the staple for, I want to say, half of the world, 3.5 billion people, to be honest. It's actually grown by 150 million smallholder farmers. Many of them are also food insecure. So many of them grow rice on less than 2 acres, sometimes less than an acre of land. And rice is a crop that needs a lot of water and a lot of water irrigation. So if you had 5 gallons of water, 4 of them would be used for the irrigation of rice. The other gallon would be used for the irrigation of all other crops in the world. So that gives you a flavor of how relevant this topic is. And I would like to offer us three lenses to look at the problem. So one is the mitigation lens, which is pretty clear. We need to reduce the methane emissions. The second is the adaptation lens, which also is pretty clear. Many of those rice farming communities do not have reliable supplies of water in the same way they had before. And then last but not least, you have the access element of it. This is a problem that is squarely located in Asia, and it's a problem that is squarely located in smallholding communities. So when we talk about a just transition, I couldn't think of a better topic than rice to focus on. Now, here's the good news. There is a solution to this problem, which requires a change in practice from the traditional paddy rice to dry seeded rice practices. And that's a solution welcomed in countries like India, China, Bangladesh, Vietnam. But the point is we need to accelerate the transformation. We are working on it together with lots of partners. And there is one added benefit of this transition. You can actually use your arable land twice in a year. So you get a double dipping on your harvest, which then, of course, contributes to the goal of also improving the overall nutrition of those communities. So there are lots of wins here. Our biggest challenge is how can we accelerate this transformation, and how can the transformation of rice production be one of the focus topics in what's being discussed often with numbers and very abstract under the headline of just transition, or the headline I even like less, which is the headline of loss and damage.
Thanks, Matthias. Can we stay on this topic? It's direct seeded rice, right? That you're talking about?
That is correct. So you move from paddy rice to direct seeded rice, which means you don't need as much water in the irrigation. You save roughly 30%, which often makes the difference between the natural replenishment of groundwater and the depletion that we see in many regions, especially in Asia at the moment.
And so if I know Bayer is investing a lot in this, and you had some big announcements last year. What's the business case from Bayer's perspective to invest in direct seeded rice, but beyond the environmental benefits, beyond some of the labor and cost benefits for farmers?
Well, there are two business benefits I see immediately. So one is we basically look at the 150 million hectares of rice, which is roughly 370 million acres, and we can actually leverage a portion of that for growing more than one crop. So for example, for adding a vegetable crops to the mix. We have seen in Brazil that Brazilian agriculture was able to get 2 harvests per season, which is one of the reasons why in Brazil agriculture took off in the last 20, 30 years. So we can do something similar on rice. And of course, for a company that sells more vegetable seeds than most other companies in the world, that's a huge opportunity.
Thanks, Matthias. I want to come back to some of these things in a minute, but Catherine, you know, when you were giving your intro, you were talking about sort of different feed additions that could help reduce methane emissions from livestock. And I'm wondering if you can talk about some of, you know, we've been hearing a lot about incorporating seaweed into feed. You talked about black soldier fly. What do you think is most sort of effective? We may have lost Catherine. Lisa, if I can come to you while Catherine is maybe trying to get back online. When we think about greenhouse gas emissions from food waste, you know, you mentioned that so much of this is coming from landfills. Can you talk about the environmental and going back? I really want to dig into that nutrition impact of wasted resources when food goes uneaten.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that approximately half of all food loss and waste is around fruits and vegetables, so highly nutritious product. And Danny, what I really liked about what you said, you know, as well is we're also thinking about animal proteins and also dairy and the like that is being lost, you know, and at different points in the supply chain. And I think that definitely as a global community, we are really not set up to measure this challenge really well, even from a kilo standpoint or a
Right.
nutrient standpoint. So when it comes to taking action on this issue, it becomes very, very challenging. And I think that's also now translating as we are talking about the important role food loss and waste can play kind of in the climate mitigation space and the methane mitigation space overall. We are really need a lot of investment in terms of methodologies of how do we measure what exactly is being lost and wasted, and what is the opportunity that if we
Yeah.
were to do a prevention piece, or in the case, obviously, I work with food banking organizations, so we believe redistribution has a real role to play in this, but we need to be able to quantify that opportunity. One of the things we've been working on for the past year or so is developing a methodology specifically around if we were to avoid losing or wasting food, what would the impact be on methane emission prevention? And we're actually piloting this methodology with our partners in Ecuador and Mexico and planning to kind of implement this globally. But we really want to give governments and also businesses that are involved in the agriculture and food system, the opportunity to see not the environmental impact that this can make. But I think the other big piece is this, and this is why I think it's wonderful that you, Danny, have been such an advocate for this for 15 plus years and beyond. And then also what Earthrin and others are doing at Food Systems of the Future is we need to be looking at this from a co-benefit standpoint, right? So this is not just about kind of the environmental piece. This is about the real opportunity to increase access to nutritious food, and also livelihood development for growers alongside. And I think that as we kind of advance this conversation about these food systems transformations, is thinking about how do we hold all of those pieces together. So when we're making decisions, it's not just purely through the methane emission mitigation lens, but also thinking about you have a series of communities that need access to this food. We're already investing in terms of the natural resources, the labor, et cetera, to grow that food. And we have to make sure it's provided to people that are facing those nutritional challenges.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So well said, and such important work. I do want to commend the Global Food Banking Network for all that they do on these issues. Bruce, one of the things I think about, especially as Lisa is talking, is some of this is going to be so place and community specific, especially when you're talking about food loss and waste, but also when you're talking about alternative proteins. And I'm wondering how we can make alternative proteins culturally relevant for eaters in a way so that they want to eat them. They don't feel like they're sacrificing not eating meat, but that they want to eat these foods because they remind them of growing up in some way, or they fit their culture. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, Danny, absolutely. And it only works if consumers want to eat the products. Just like renewable energy and electric vehicles, people aren't going to pay more. They're not going to sacrifice. So the whole focus has to be make the products appeal to consumers. And that's largely a function of are they delicious? Are they reasonably priced? And are they nutritious? And so that absolutely has to be the focus. Michael Kremer and his commission at the University of Chicago at COP, they released their list of 7 interventions that they think will be particularly good for dealing with hunger and malnutrition, as well as climate mitigation, as well as climate adaptation. And they dived into some of these questions. One of the 7 interventions is alternative proteins. And they talked about alternative proteins as a direct intervention in developing economies. But it's also, similar to renewable energy and electric vehicle transition. It's also something where the people who have been doing the most damage, developed economies, really need to lean in and sort of be first movers. And we do need the all of the above strategy, a shift to 50% alternative proteins, according to the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis. A shift to 50% will net us 3.1 gigatons in mitigation, and it will open up 650 million hectares of land for sequestration, and that's conservative relative to McKinsey analysis. So that's a lot more than 100% of cars go electric vehicles. It's 3 times as much as simply eliminating air travel. And it opens up options for people in developing economies because it frees up land and lowers food prices, according to that analysis as well. So the co-benefits are really significant.
Thank you so much. If it's okay, I'd like to bring Britt Grossman into the conversation because we've lost Catherine Pickus from Tyson, unfortunately. And Britt is the president of Climate Smart Agriculture at the Environmental Defense Fund. Britt, can you join us on? Thank you so much. I'm going to just shift some of the questions I had for Catherine to you, if that's okay. And if I don't ask the right question, you'll tell me.
I'll try my best.
You'll answer.
Thank you, Danny.
I was trying to talk to her about sort of the different feeds that can be that can help reduce methane emissions from livestock production. And I mentioned seaweed. Catherine had mentioned black soldier fly larvae. Can you talk about how these things have the opportunity to reduce emissions from the livestock industry right now? And, Bruce was talking about alternative proteins. That's certainly one strategy. And then, this is another one. And it's kind of what Bruce was seeing. We need all of the tools, we need all of the tools in the toolbox, this all of the above strategy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yes, happy to. So before we get to the sort of additive or supplements that you can feed to cattle, I do want to bring another solution to the forefront, which is improved health and improved feed of the animals, so general feed. So at the moment, there's a huge discrepancy between how animals are fed, what their health is like, and it creates huge differences between methane imprint of whatever you eat. So if you think about a gallon of milk or a pound of beef that you might be eating, it could be as much as a sort of 10 times unit difference in 1 gallon of milk in terms of methane. Because if you think about it, methane, when a cow burps, it's basically a loss of energy, it's an inefficiency. And so if you feed a cow a sort of a better and more nutritious diet, there will be less of that. So I always take the example of the cows in California dairies who are basically fed what I call like a sort of super athlete diet, like really kind of not sort of haphazard mix, but really like a really good mix. So before we even go to the sort of the new additives that we could give cattle, we need to think about how we can ensure that we improve the health and diets of all cattle around the world. And that's especially important in developing economies where they may not have access to these super diets. So obviously brings us to the question of how do we help farmers then access knowledge, financial means to make this shift. So that's one thing. Now assume that every cow gets this kind of best health and best diet, then there will still be emissions. So the dairy in California, the ones where you have the super diets and the super health, they still have a sort of a large imprint, and that's where we're looking at sort of additives. And there's, as you say, there's a couple of things being looked at. There's one product that was actually developed called a Bovar or 3-NOP, which is an additive that is being trialed in many economies around the world, in Europe, in Brazil. It's not yet FDA approved here in the US, but that's one that has at the moment sort of the highest prospect. Then there are other products like you say the red seaweed, where the potential reductions are also really high, but there's still some research being done on the long-term health impacts. And for all these products, one of the big questions will be the long-term effects. Will the cow get used to it? And will the products that are being given maybe not be as efficient in the long term? But I do want to make sure that we don't forget this really important component of just normal nutrition and health of cattle and how much reductions that can give us.
Sure. Thank you so much, Britt, and thank you for standing in for
No
Catherine.
problem.
I know you're an expert on these issues too. This might be a question for all of you, but I'll start with Bruce and Britt. When Bruce was talking about sort of there's this, if we reduced our consumption of animal products, what the impacts could be. But everything we're talking about, I think in this webinar, requires huge behavior change, right? It requires cultural shifts. And so I'm wondering how we can encourage more eaters and farmers and ranchers to shift both their sort of practices to what you all are suggesting, and also have eaters change their consumption patterns. These shifts are not easy, and I wonder what you all sort of think about how they'll happen. So maybe I don't know who wants to start. Maybe I'll stay with you for a moment, Britt.
Oh, I was going to kick it to Bruce first. Happy to try. This is not something that the consumer bit is not something that we actively work on at EDF at this point, because we know it is so culturally difficult, and there's so many great organizations in the world working on these issues. I always think about Meatless Monday and Paul McCartney, for instance. On the how do you get farmers and growers to change practice, often that comes down to giving them access to the knowledge, the technology, and then obviously the bottom line, make it affordable for them. So so we look at all those pieces together. For instance, the product that's not available yet in the US, we need to look at why it is so hard to get FDA approval for these things. Why is it so much harder than it is in Europe? As a European, I'm biased. I think my food in Europe is quite safe. So why is it so hard in the US? Affordability is a very big component. Most farmers, including dairy farmers, live on the margin, even in the US and Europe, let alone in other parts of the world. They will not make a shift if they are not supported in doing so, or if they do not see productivity increases because of what they're being asked to do. And I'll kick the consumer one to Bruce, maybe. Bruce, why don't you chime in?
I mean, my answer on consumers is not significantly different, Britt, from your answer. I mean, we've seen attempts at consumer change for 50 plus years, and per capita meat consumption, even in the US, is as high as it's ever been. Globally, meat consumption, including ruminant consumption, is up 70% in the last 16 years. It's likely to be up 70% more in the last 16 years. It's more than 360 million metric tons of land animal meat, and another 210 million metric tons of sea animal meat. So just like it's valuable to encourage people to walk and ride bikes, and it's valuable to have superb public transit, we really do need electric vehicles. All of the polls about the recent crop of plant-based meats, the reason people are not buying them is that they're very expensive and meat eaters don't like them. The solution to that is probably not to keep begging people to eat them. The solution to that is to make them better. And similarly with cultivated meat, just like you can take a seed or a cutting from a plant and grow it into a full plant, you can take a small sampling of cells from a chicken or a pig or a cow and grow that into actual animal meat. And it requires far fewer resources, and it cuts the chain of production by multiple factories and multiple stages. So as it scales up, just like renewable energy and electric vehicles, it should be cost competitive. Just like we need to meet farmers where they are, we need to meet consumers where they are.
Thank you so much. Matthias, Catherine and Bruce both mentioned that we need to meet farmers where they are. Farmers are risk adverse for so many reasons because, one bad season can, make them lose the farm. When you're talking about a just transition and whether that, whether it's direct seeded rice or system of rice intensification, how do we make sure that farmers have the support that they need to try different innovations and technologies?
Well, I think, first of all, that farmers are not necessarily risk averse, but they have been adopting a lot of change. Agricultural productivity in my lifetime went up by a factor of more than 8. If farmers were risk averse and backward looking, we would never have achieved that feat. No? So I think that's one of the observations I have, is that farmers are willing to try new things, but as Britt said, many of them operate on the margins, be it smallholders where it's a matter of survival, be it larger farms, also in Europe or the United States, where it's really hard to make ends meet. So in many ways, I would think that farmers are much more innovative than one would think. On the meat side, I also want to say that there have been huge shifts in consumption in the United States. Bruce, absolutely. The overall meat consumption is still very high, but the mix has changed dramatically in the last 30, 40 years, with poultry being much more in the mix than other meat. And that again is a sign that things are changing, often quite radically. There are a few countries in Europe where the meat consumption has peaked. So in many ways, a lot is happening and we should embrace that. Now, Bayer also works on cell-cultured meat. So it's one of the areas we have invested in for two reasons. One, we believe it's a great complement to the meat market. And it has a lot of the footprint benefits that Bruce was talking about. What we don't do, though, is basically marketing cell cultured meat by pointing at the alleged or real shortcomings of the traditional meat production. You can see a backlash in Europe, where farmers have been on the streets, or in the United States, where in some states cell cultured meat is practically banned. It's not just about how you label it, it's practically banned based on lobbying state legislators. And this is a reaction of the farming community that doesn't like to be kind of cornered in the way some who are marketing the meat are going forward. I don't think that will help us at all. Here are two pragmatic solutions that would help us to scale up cell-cultured meat. One is blending. It's much more economically viable to produce ground meat, for example, ground pork, and blend it with traditional pork. And the other is leveraging the meat demand of the pet food industry. I spent a big part of my career working for a company that is one of the largest players in that space. That could be really training wheels for the cell-cultured meat industry, rather than having this very exclusive, very expensive tastings that you do at events like COPs, or you have in high-end restaurants in Washington, D.C. or New York City. There is a Main Street path for cell-cultured meat, and we need to go it. The good news is I see a lot of openness for this innovation in countries like China, where the demand for meat is increasing because the overall affordability is going up, and the disposable income for changes in food consumption allows people to just add more meat to their diet, which I think is something we shouldn't blame anybody for, given our average meat consumption in Europe or in North America.
Thanks, Matthias. Lisa, I want to stay on this topic of sort of behavior change for a minute and cultural shifts. How can we encourage this mindset shift that is needed to waste less food?
Yeah, I love this conversation because I think we're touching on so many types of interventions. First is kind of investment in technology, and the second, of course, is this pragmatic nature of how do you actually adopt this on a large scale. So obviously at the Global Food Banking Network, we connect local food redistributors across more than 50 countries. And so it's a model that really looks at, where is the surplus food occurring in the supply chain, and then how do you provide a solution to those producers that instead of discarding or landfilling that product that is nutritious and edible, can you then redistribute it to people in need? And so what we have found is that this is a very practical model for providing an outlet for surplus food that would otherwise go to waste. And I think the first piece, which is everyone is touching on, is just education. Again, because we have such bad data about how much food is actually being wasted at the local level. We have these huge numbers globally that are just kind of mind-boggling. But if you are to go up, to certain producers, they may not have a clear sense of kind of where the loss is occurring at all points in the supply chain. So I think the first thing is obviously just investing in that information system. Yeah. And then secondly, we have to find ways to just, inspire value in food. And you want to do that through incentives as much as you can. But then also we have found that policy reform is really, really critical. Something we've been taking on for the past 5 years is looking at what are the policy frameworks in place to address food loss and waste prevention and then redistribution. And what we've largely found is that nearly every country in the world has lack of sufficient policy frameworks, and many have virtually nothing. And so there's lots of no-cost things you can do along the way. First, actually starting with quantifying the amount that is being lost or wasted, but then you can think about how do you remove barriers to food donation. I mean, if a company has to pay VAT to donate their product, they're not going to be doing that. It's often more expensive to donate than it is to landfill it. You can also think about incentives along those lines, guidance on food safety for a product that is not saleable anymore, but might still be nutritious. And then, of course, I think we need a very significant policy focus on capturing these highly perishable, nutritious foods, whether it be fruits and veg that are often coming on farm or post-harvest, and things like animal protein and dairy. And you need a very fast system to do that redistribution. Now, one of that outlet, of course, is charitable, which is, of course, the work that we're in. We have about 32 million people a year accessing food through our network across 6 continents, but I think there needs to be a lot more investment in the circularity of food. So obviously prevention is king. It's got to be done. But at the end of the day, with the way our markets are, with the way we are producing food as we're doing this shift, we need to consider these interventions around redistribution and other forms of circularity, kind of in line with that food loss and waste hierarchy. So I think that's an investment priority that we're going to have to make over the next decade to see meaningful environmental and social impacts.
Thank you so much. The awareness has finally gotten there on food loss and waste, but now what we need is like sort of the action for sure. I want to make sure we get to Q&A, but I have one question for you all. So be pretty succinct in your answers if you can. I think it's been really inspiring that there has been so much focus on methane, that it is increasing. It's so promising. During COP28, we saw the launch of the Dairy Methane Action Alliance. Can we focus on this idea? All of you are collaborating, in different ways with different institutions or one another. Can we talk about why this collaboration and partnership is so key when we're talking about methane specifically? Matthias, if you can go first, and again, try to be succinct.
Well, we are looking at this topic from the beginning of the chain, so from the feed side of things. Hardly ever people were looking at breeding corn plants that are more palatable and less prone to support methane emissions. But at the same time, there's a lot of corn being fed to ruminants. So what can we do to reduce the overall emissions in that space by breeding very different varieties? So that's one example. And Britt has mentioned the other very important topic, and that is that we have an order of magnitude spread by way of emissions that you can get from a cow. And here again, it's about partnering from the start and then all the way to Katie, who obviously is not here today, who is ultimately in the meat packing space, then the ones that are actually commercializing the kind of meat we are talking about, or in the dairy space, of course, these kind of companies. So for us, it's really important, but we can't leave the farmers out of sight here. They are the ones that actually should not be blamed, but should be invited to partner.
I couldn't agree more with you. Britt.
Yeah, no, I think we really have to collaborate on so many things because there are no silver bullet solutions here. I think we really need to see so many angles of it. It is about all of the above, everything we've discussed. It's about reducing the food loss and waste, making sure that that can go to good use once the methane of the production has already been happening, as if, you know, if you're wasting food, meat or protein or rice, but then obviously the methane from the loss as well. We need to collaborate across research, investment into new solutions. We need to collaborate around talking to consumers, talking to producers, and we need to sort of make sure that we all sort of all hands on deck is basically what I would like to say.
Thanks, Britt. Bruce.
Yeah, I mean, it's methane as a percentage of total climate change is really quite large. It has traditionally been vastly under-resourced, under-prioritized. You know, Britt talking about livestock interventions and how early they are is also just an indication of how little resources they have gotten relative to other solutions. That's also true of alternative proteins. It's true of food loss and waste, as underscored by the observation about just how little measurement we even have at this point. So they look like they are very likely extraordinarily tractable interventions for decreasing climate emissions. And we really need an all of the above strategy because nothing is a lock. I think most people agree that climate targets are going to be hard to meet at this point. We should still do the best we can around mitigation, and these are all just super promising.
Yeah, the urgency is there. We need the action again. Lisa, I'll end with you before we go to Q&A.
Yeah. So I just, you know, I think that one of the most fascinating things about working on food, right? And Danny always say that everyone's an eater, right? So we all have this stake in the global food system. But I think that, you know, especially what we have learned is that a lot of on the food loss and waste side, these losses, this waste is happening at a very local level. And so, you know, that's part of, you know, we need macro action on these, you know, incredibly micro issues. And there's real examples of good work being done at the local level. And I think that the engagement of grassroots organization as a way, we need so much innovation in the space. And I think there really needs to be a scan and a very significant amount of engagement of some of these grassroots players that are often absent, I think, in some of these larger, certainly regional and global dialogues to find out what is being done on the circularity standpoint at the local level that could be scaled up. And it's not always just about kind of the big players and certainly about government, although they have a critical role to play. So I think that needs to be a big priority as we're thinking about the agenda in the future. And of course, as a part of the just transition as well.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So I want to thank Megan O'Hearn for feeding me questions from the audience during this. And I'm going to start with a very provocative one, and it relates to something Matthias said earlier. So the audience member asks, will farmers have an opportunity to speak, or just the corporations and who seek to destroy farmers? Do farmers get any credit for the good that they do? And so, you know, what are the incentives for behavior change? And I sort of truncated that a little, but I don't know who wants to take that on. I always feel like, you know, food panels often are missing farmers, and you know, it's always hard to get farmers involved in these things. So I just wonder what your thoughts are, and I don't know who wants to address that first.
I'm happy to jump in.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's crucial that we work with farmers on this. This is not against farmers. Farmers are part of the solution. Farmers feed us on a daily basis, and we are so very grateful for that. And really, we are working towards solutions that will help farmers have a good livelihood for the long term. So that's why when we're talking about sort of what can we do with livestock farmers, we often think about, does this solution make sense for them? Does it either you know, increase their productivity, like teaching a farmer how to take better care of their cow or to have better nutrition? Or does it improve productivity? If not, how can they be compensated for that loss of productivity? Right. So this is really about sort of helping farmers, and, you know, in every transition, we need to make sure that there is, this sort of equitable piece of it. And there's big farmers, there's small farmers, and we want to make sure that we talk to all of them. So thank you for that question. Farmers are absolutely an essential component of this work.
Yeah, I think there's been sort of a go big or get out ethos in farming for such a long time, and that is squeezing farmers and causing huge issues. But I mean, I think the entire premise of this panel and the idea of equitable solutions that are sort of all of the above positive strategies is so critical to how we have the conversation, because obviously we're not going to do anything that involves food systems transformation unless farmers are a part of it. And farmers, I think, really do need to be centered in all of the policy conversations and the way forward across all of these strategies, whether you're talking about rice mitigation or livestock mitigation or food loss and waste. Farmers really need to be central.
Thank you so much. Matthias, what can a company like Bayer do to incentivize farmers to take on some of these innovations, that Bayer is developing that could be quite expensive for them, or require them to purchase more inputs than they previously did, even though it could be good for methane mitigation?
Well, what we are doing is we are crowding in a lot of players, for example, to support the smallholder farmers in the rice space to be able to do this transition. Yeah, so be it international finance institutions like the World Bank or USAID on the US side, be it companies that want to mitigate some of their emissions and are willing to put real dollars behind that commitment. Be it other innovators in the space. So that is something we can do. And I believe that when we talk about just transition, it's also very much about the access to innovation. So one of the areas that Lisa talked about is food loss. Of course, you are very much focused, Lisa, on the food loss at the very end of the food supply chain. What makes me kind of sad is to see food loss on the field. So how can we ensure, for example, for plants like cassava that are extremely important for smallholder farmers in Africa, the Foundation for Nutrition, that we avoid food loss on the field by giving them access to the latest breeding technology that allows cassava to be more resilient against certain viruses being transmitted by insects is one example. Tomatoes can be much more stable and less perishable. How can we make sure that those varieties are actually in the hands as seed in the hands of farming communities? And I think when we talk just transition, let's move away from the pure dollar conversation to a conversation that looks at both the access to innovation as well as the necessary needs to invest behind things. Very important also for the next COP conversation that we do not just look at US dollars, but also as access to all the solutions that would allow farmers today with innovations that already exist to have a much better livelihood than they currently experience.
Thanks, Matthias. Lisa, do you want to comment? There's a specific question for you, Lisa, and then I'll turn it over to Britt. What is around using livestock to recycle food waste to make nutrient-dense protein? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I saw that question and I really appreciate the person who raised it. There is an enormous amount of opportunity, I think, thinking about it as potentially a source for animal feed. Again, all elements of circularity as it relates to food, kind of beyond the prevention side, I think are very underinvested in. And so I think we need to be considering kind of surplus food that can be edible. There's a number of ways that can be marketed either at discount costs or obviously at donated to improve food access and access to nutrients. And then for the inedible portions of food, thinking about all the different ways that we might be able to use that for animal feed, for energy, and then obviously as it diminishes more in value, certainly along the lines of composting. And so that's why I think this the data is so important, and having a really good methodology in place about what is the opportunity for mitigation kind of at each stage of as food loses its edibility and value, I think is really important as we're moving ahead.
Thank you. Great point to end on. I want to thank all of the panelists for sharing their expertise and knowledge. I want to thank Food Systems for the Future for organizing this event. Happy Earth Day, everyone, and thanks to everyone watching online. Now I want to turn it back to Britt Grossman for some final words of wisdom. Over to you, Britt.
Thank you so much, Danny. Wow, this flew. We could have talked for hours more, I'm sure. Yeah, thank you to all the panelists today. It was so great to hear all your wisdom and many great ideas, and also the questions from the audience. Much appreciated. So as Earther and Cousin described at the start of the webinar, EDF is actually joining forces with FSF and 4SD to co-create a process where we hope to look at realistic pathways for this very complex issue of the need of both methane mitigation and nutrition security, which is a dual goal. And to the people who are asking about farmer voices, we are opening this invitation for co-creation to all groups who want to be involved. So really the question we've heard here today was, how can we help accelerate the transformation needed? I think many of the speakers spoke of potential solutions they are aware of, good data, good reasons to do things, but really how do we help make this happen faster? And one of the things we are very much thinking about is, what is the ultimate business case for those businesses and farmers? I put farmers in that group. And how can we ensure that there is really an equitable, just transition for farmers to ensure that there is access for safe and nutritious food? And one thing we haven't mentioned here today, but that's crucially important, is the price of food. I think one of the people spoke about it, but the price of food is something that we need to be very careful for in any transition. So the just transition has to also include consumers. So partnership and collaboration is what we're looking forward to, and this includes the farm community, researchers, private companies, NGOs, and grassroots working on people's access to safe and healthy food. So I invite all of you to keep track of FSF and EDF's websites, where we'll be announcing some more of this work. We're starting with a listening tour, where we're talking to a lot of parties about what they see as barriers, potential solutions. One of the things we are finding is that sometimes people are working in silos, maybe even camps against each other, and that's one of the things that we really want to avoid. We want to bring together sort of what we could think of as perhaps unlikely bedfellows, like the livestock industry with the alternative protein industry, because there is really no one silver bullet, no one solution here. So thank you, Danny, and all the panelists for this this great webinar today. Danny, do you want to close?
I just want to thank everyone again. Happy Earth Day, and please get in touch with FSF and EDF if you want more information. But thank you again, everyone.